The gym floor of Clover Ridge Elementary is dark at 4:30 in the morning. A flashlight beam cuts across 30 years of waxed hardwood, slow, deliberate, the beam of a man who has walked this building alone so many times he knows which boards creak before he steps on them. He stops. Something is wrong with the silence. It takes him 3 seconds to understand what he's hearing. 4 more to cross the floor. His work boots echo off the cinder block walls, and he cannot make them quiet, so he stops trying. In the far corner, behind the folding table rack, there is a cardboard box. Inside the box, a blue blanket with yellow ducks. Inside the blanket, something small and alive and fighting with everything it has. He kneels. His flashlight finds a piece of notebook paper, safety pinned to the edge of the fabric. 5 words in blue ink. Please take care of her. He reaches into the box. Kenneth Lee sat at the kitchen table at 7 in the evening. Not because he wanted to sit there, because his feet carried him there out of habit. The way they had for more years than he could count. The kitchen table was where he ate breakfast at 4:30 in the morning before catching the bus. The kitchen table was where he paid bills on Fridays. The kitchen table was where 3 girls did homework for the better part of 2 decades, while he mopped the floor around them and pretended not to help with the math problems they read out loud to no one in particular. Now it was just him and a white envelope. The return address said Millhaven County School District. The corner stamp said Certified Mail. The words Civil Complaint were printed in a font designed to feel official and final, which it did, which was probably the point. Kenneth opened it, read the first page, set it up again, read it a second time, slower, the way you read something. When you're hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something less damaging if you give them enough time. They didn't. He set it back down and looked at his hands. 40 years of working with those hands. The callus at the base of his right index finger from gripping a mop handle 6 days a week through winters cold enough to freeze the pipes under the gymnasium floor. The scar running along the back of his left hand from the afternoon a wrench slipped in December when he was replacing corroded fittings behind the bleachers, and the metal opened his skin clean as a paper cut. Except it wasn't. Except it bled for 20 minutes into a rag he kept in his back pocket for emergencies. The permanent dark line under the nail of his left thumb that no amount of scrubbing with the industrial soap from the supply closet had ever managed to lift. Misappropriation of district resources. 47,000. His name in capital letters at the top of every page. Those hands had just been called the hands of a thief. Kenneth sat in the quiet kitchen and read the word misappropriation 4 more times, turning it over in his mind, the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath. Not because you want to find something, but because you can't stop yourself. The kitchen smelled like the morning's coffee, which he hadn't finished, which he never finished because he brewed it at 4:30 and lost track of it somewhere around the 3rd repair request of the day. The fluorescent light above the sink made that low buzzing sound it had been making for 3 months. He had written replace ballast in his spiral notebook in January. He had not yet replaced it. He got up, got the notebook from the junk drawer, wrote replace kitchen ballast again, in case he'd forgotten, which he hadn't, but writing it made him feel like something was still under control. He put the notebook back and sat down. 3 chairs sat around the table and none of them matched. The oak chair with the ladder back he found at a garage sale on Birch Street. When Sandra was 2 years old and he needed a second chair, because his only other one was the wooden stool he used at his workbench in the garage. He paid $4 for it. The man selling it said the joints were a little loose. Kenneth tightened them that night with wood glue and a clamp made from a bicycle inner tube, and the chair had not moved since. The metal folding chair he brought home from the school after they replaced the cafeteria furniture 12 years ago. New chairs were being delivered on a Thursday, and the old ones were going to a dumpster, and Kenneth asked Principal Gary Young if he could take one, and Gary said sure, take 2, and Kenneth took one because he only needed one. The wooden stool Stephanie painted blue when she was 12, without asking permission, which he hadn't minded once he saw it. because the blue was a good blue, the color of sky on a cold, clear morning, and Stephanie had painted it carefully. 2 coats. Let it dry properly between them. Cleaned the brush when she was done. He didn't ask where she'd gotten the paint. He suspected it was from the can he kept in the garage for touch-ups. He chose not to investigate. 3 chairs. None of them purchased as a set. All of them at a table where someone had once needed to sit, and so he had found a chair. He looked at them for a while, then he picked up the phone and called Sandra. She answered on the second ring. She was the only one of the 3 who called him by his first name. Laura called him Dad. Stephanie called him Pop. Sandra had tried both when she was small and settled on Kenneth, which he privately loved, because his mother used to say his name exactly like that, with the same particular weight, as though the name itself contained an expectation. She trusted him to meet Kenneth. Not a question. She knew from his calling time, 7 in the evening on a Tuesday, that something was off. He never called on Tuesdays. He called Sundays after church, which he attended out of a habit 30 years old, and sometimes on Saturday afternoons if he'd finished his list and found himself sitting in a quiet house with nowhere to be. Evie, are you busy? He still called her Evie sometimes, a name she'd had as a child, a name that suited the small, serious girl who used to sit in his supply closet doing her homework with a flashlight because the overhead bulb had burned out and he'd been meaning to replace it, and she hadn't mentioned it was out for 2 days before he noticed. Going through case files. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, Kenneth. He rubbed his forehead. The district sent some paperwork over. It's probably nothing. What kind of paperwork? He looked at the pile on the table, the white pages under the harsh kitchen light, his name over and over. They're saying I took some things from the school. Supplies. Equipment. They've got a list. The line went quiet. Not the quiet of bad reception. The quiet of a person deciding something very quickly and not making it obvious. How much are they claiming? He hesitated. There was no good way to say a number like that. 47,000. The silence this time was longer. When Sandra spoke, her voice had changed. The warmth was still there, underneath, the way heat stays in a stone after the sun has moved off it. But the surface was different, cooler, precise. Don't talk to anyone from the district. Don't sign anything. Don't answer calls from their office, Evie. It's just some paperwork. You've got interviews lined up. You passed the bar 2 months ago. Don't blow up your schedule over. I'm already packing. A pause, and then, don't touch the papers on the table. Don't move them around. Leave everything exactly where it is. And then the line clicked. She was gone. Kenneth set the phone on the table next to the white envelope and sat in the buzzing silence of his kitchen. The fluorescent light went on buzzing. He looked at the notebook, still sitting on the counter. He thought about getting it and writing call electrician to stop himself from thinking about anything else, but he left it where it was. He was not afraid of losing. He understood loss. He had lost his son Daniel to a fever that came on fast and moved faster. A child who at 3 years old had a gap between his front teeth and laughed with his entire body. A child Kenneth had been telling a story about a dog who could fly while the monitors beeped faster and faster, and then stopped. He had lost his wife to a morning when she put a bag in the back of her car and drove away without leaving a note, not out of cruelty, he had eventually concluded, but out of a private grief she couldn't translate into words and couldn't bear to explain. He had lost any possibility of a comfortable life the morning. He heard a sound in an empty gymnasium and walked toward it instead of away from it. He knew how to lose things. What he was afraid of was what this would do to the 3 women who were going to find out about it. That was the fear. That was the thing sitting in his chest at 7:13 on a Tuesday evening in his kitchen in Millhaven. The parking lot was empty at 4:30 in the morning, 24 years ago. A different morning, a different version of this life. Kenneth pulled his old Ford pickup into the lot and cut the engine and sat for a moment with his thermos and his list. He liked this part of the day more than any other part. The school was dark. The town was dark. It was just him and the building and the particular silence of a place that was meant to hold people but didn't yet. He let himself in through the side entrance with the key that had worn a groove in his right front pocket from 10 years of use. He walked the main hallway by the beam of his flashlight because he hadn't yet switched the overheads on. That was a ritual. The flashlight first, then the lights. A way of seeing the building the way it actually was before the day asked it to be something else. He checked the boiler first. Always the boiler in winter. Then the hallway near the second-grade classrooms where the floor tiles had been lifting, and a child had caught her shoe on one and gone down hard enough to scrape both palms, and he reported it twice, and the report had sat on a desk, and he'd finally fixed it himself with adhesive and a heat gun on a Saturday. Then the gymnasium. He pushed open the gym doors. Something was crying. He stood in the doorway. His flashlight beam went through the dark and found the far wall, the scoreboard, the folded-up bleachers. The sound bounced off the hardwood floor and the cinder block walls, and came back to him, doubled, tripled, larger than it should have been for something so small. He moved slowly. His work boots echoed in the empty gym, and he couldn't make them quiet, so he stopped trying. The crying got louder as he crossed the floor. He found it in the far corner, behind the storage rack, where the folding tables were kept. A cardboard box, brown, the kind copy paper came in, sitting against the wall, as though someone had set it down carefully and deliberately, and then left. Inside the box, a blanket, blue, printed with small yellow ducks. Inside the blanket, a baby. A few days old, he would learn later. At the time he only knew small. He knew the red face and the clenched fists and the mouth open in a howl that seemed too large for such a small body to produce. He crouched down. His knees cracked against the hardwood floor. He moved the flashlight and found a piece of lined paper, torn from a spiral notebook, safety pinned to the edge of the blanket. 5 words in blue ink, handwritten, in the careful printing of someone who had thought about what they needed to say and could not say more than this. Please take care of her. No name, no explanation, no apology. A statement of need addressed to whoever would find it, written in the belief that someone would. Kenneth looked at the baby. She couldn't see him yet, not properly, not the way older children could. Her eyes were squeezed shut against the effort of crying. Her fists were tight against her chest. She was working very hard at the only communication available to her, and it was working. It had worked. Here he was. His hands were shaking. He hadn't held a baby since Daniel. The last time was in a hospital room where the overhead lights were too bright, and a nurse had said something gentle that he hadn't been able to hear properly over the sound of the monitors. He had been telling Daniel about a dog who could fly. He had been using his good voice, the story voice, trying to keep his son's eyes focused on his face. He hadn't known yet that the monitors would stop. He found out while he was mid-sentence. That was 11 years before this cold gymnasium and this cardboard box and these 5 words. He reached into the box. She weighed almost nothing. The back of her fit in his palm. Her head fit in the crook of his elbow. He held her against his chest, and she kept crying. But she turned her face into the fabric of his jacket, and her fists opened just slightly. Just enough, as though the warmth and the heartbeat were information she was processing. "Hey," he said. His voice came out rough from the early hour and from something else he didn't have a name for. "Hey now, it's all right." She didn't stop crying. He hadn't expected her to, but she turned her face further into his jacket and made a sound that was slightly different from crying, closer to the sound of a person who has decided to wait and see. He took that as something. He wasn't sure what, but he took it. "My name is Kenneth. I'm the custodian here. I fix things. That's what I do." He was walking now, pacing slowly toward the door, bouncing her slightly, the way something in his arms seemed to know to do without being instructed. "So let's get you sorted out." He carried her to the front office. He called the police. They came in 11 minutes. The ambulance came 6 minutes after that. A woman from social services arrived at 7 in the morning, by which time Kenneth had moved to the supply closet because it was the warmest room in the building, and he had unwrapped his Carhartt jacket from over his uniform shirt and rewrapped it around the baby, and the baby had stopped crying 20 minutes ago and was sleeping against his chest. The paramedics checked her over. Healthy, cold, hungry, malnourished by a few days, but healthy. No sign of injury. Someone had wrapped her carefully. Someone had tried. "We'll have a placement by Thursday," the social worker said. Her name was Carol, and she had the eyes of someone who had been doing this work for long enough that she felt things, through a professional distance that protected her without erasing her. She looked at Kenneth, a man in his early 50s in a work jacket, holding a newborn in a school supply closet at 7 in the morning. She looked at him for a long time. "We have emergency foster families. Where does she go tonight?" "One of those families." "I have a room," Kenneth said. Came out before he'd decided to say it. But he didn't take it back. "It was my son's. He passed a while ago. I have the room and the crib is still in there. I haven't opened the door in a long time, but I can open it." Carol looked at him. She looked at the baby. "Thursday," she said. "We'll have placement by Thursday." Thursday came and went. The placement fell through. Kenneth had the baby in the crib with the wooden star mobile he'd carved by hand the year Daniel was born. The mobile that had been spinning above an empty mattress for 11 years, and now it was spinning again. The few days turned into a week. The week turned into 2. The social worker called with updates that were not updates. Emergency placements were full. Foster families had waiting lists. Was Kenneth managing? Did he need supplies? He needed everything. He did not say so. He went to the dollar store on his lunch break and bought diapers and bottles and burp cloths and a plastic tub for bathing her. The school principal, Gary Young, a man who wore the same 3 ties on rotation and had known Kenneth since he started at Clover Ridge, said Kenneth could bring the baby to work. He didn't put it in writing. He just walked past the supply closet one morning, looked in at the car seat Kenneth had found at a thrift store for $6, looked at the baby sleeping in it, and said use the back office. If the school board comes through. Then he walked on. The second-grade teacher brought a bag of her youngest daughter's old clothes. The music teacher left formula on the supply closet counter without explanation. The lunch cook started making an extra plate and sliding it through the pass-through, with a look that said, "This is not a conversation we're having," and Kenneth would eat it standing over the counter because sitting down felt like something he didn't have time for until the end of the day. Nobody asked him what his plan was. Nobody told him he was in over his head. They watched a man who had been moving through his days for 11 years, with something missing behind his eyes, and now whatever had been missing was back. And that was all anyone needed to understand about the situation. He named her Sandra, his mother's name, a woman who had spent 40 years cooking in the cafeteria of a public school in eastern Ohio and raised 4 children on a salary that would not stretch no matter how she tried to stretch it, and never once suggested to any of her children that this was a burden they were responsible for. When Kenneth was 10 years old and being teased by 2 boys in his class for wearing the same pair of shoes every day for 3 months, his mother sat him down at the kitchen table after dinner and said, "You are enough, Kenneth. Don't let anyone tell you different." He had been 34 years old, crouching on a gymnasium floor in the dark, when he first felt the full weight of what she'd meant. If this baby was going to carry anyone's name, it was going to be hers. 4 months in, Carol called with a different tone. "Mr. Lee, we still don't have a placement. No family members have come forward. No one has made an inquiry. At this point, the likelihood of a biological family reunion is very low." A pause. "I want to be honest with you about that. What happens to her now?" "She goes into the foster system." He was quiet. He looked at Sandra, who was lying on her back on the floor of the supply closet on the blanket from the cardboard box, studying the ceiling with the enormous seriousness of a 4-month-old. "What? If I keep her, you'd have to petition for custody. There would be a hearing, a background check, home visits. How do I start?" 3 weeks later, Kenneth sat in the Millhaven County Courthouse in the one suit he owned, a Navy 2-piece he'd bought at the Salvation Army the year his wife left because he'd needed something to wear to a job interview, and he'd never found cause to buy another one. It hung wide across his shoulders. He had polished his shoes with a rag and a dab of cooking oil, because he was out of shoe polish and hadn't thought to buy more. The judge looked at the file. He looked at Kenneth. "Mr. Lee, you're asking this court to grant you permanent custody of an infant." "Yes, sir." "You work as a custodian." "Yes, sir." "And you're proposing to raise this child alone." "Yes, sir." The judge looked at him over his reading glasses, with the expression of a man trying to determine whether the person in front of him understood what he was getting into. "Have you considered the financial requirements? Medical costs, schooling, the basic necessities of raising a child from infancy through adulthood?" Kenneth sat up straight. The suit didn't fit. He filled it anyway with everything he had. "Your Honor, I know what I am. I mop floors and fix pipes. I don't make a lot of money. But that baby was left on my floor, in my building, at 4:30 in the morning. And I was the one who found her. I've been feeding her and changing her and sitting up with her every night for 4 months. Nobody else came forward. Not a single person." He stopped for a moment. "She needed someone. I was there." Carol took the stand. "In 4 months," she said, "there had been no inquiries about the child, no family contact, no leads. Kenneth Lee had been the child's sole caregiver since the night she was found. The child was healthy, gaining weight appropriately, meeting all developmental milestones, and in the professional assessment of someone who had done this work for 19 years, he was the most attentive caregiver she had encountered in her career." The judge granted temporary custody that afternoon. Full custody came 6 months later, after 3 home visits and a background check that came back clean, because Kenneth Lee had not, in 54 years, broken a law. He walked out of the courthouse with Sandra in one arm and a folder of legal documents in the other. A woman from the clerk's office held the door. She said he had a good heart. He looked at Sandra, who was chewing on the collar of his jacket, same as she had been on the night he found her. "She needed someone," he said. "That's all it is." That was 24 years ago. Sandra took her first steps in his kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter with both hands, and then letting go with the expression of someone who had just made a decision they couldn't take back. She sat at that table every evening through elementary school and middle school and high school, doing homework, arguing about curfews, reading case summaries out loud in her second year of law school, because she said it helped her retain them, which Kenneth doubted, but never said. She passed the bar exam 2 months ago. Kenneth sat in the 3rd row when she was sworn in. He wore the Navy suit. It still didn't fit. Now he sat at that same table with a stack of papers that called him a thief, and he was waiting for her to come home. Laura's mother was a woman named Donna Jackson. She worked double shifts at the Millhaven Diner, breakfast through close, 6 days a week. She had rough hands from the dish sink and a good smile, and she braided her daughter's hair every morning before school in a tight plait down her back and sent her out in clean clothes, regardless of what the morning had cost her to arrange. She was a careful woman. She was a woman who made things work through the sheer force of showing up and refusing to stop. Her daughter was 5 years old, small for her age. She sat in the back of the 1st grade classroom because she was quiet, and some of the other children had discovered that quietness could be a useful target. Every afternoon at 3:15, when the halls cleared and the buses pulled away, a small girl appeared at the door of Kenneth's supply closet. She didn't knock. She arrived the way weather arrives. She climbed up onto the overturned plastic tub near the door and sat with her backpack in her lap and said, "Mr. Kenneth, do you have crackers?" He always had crackers. After the 2nd time she came, he started keeping a box of saltines in the lower cabinet, and after the 3rd time he started keeping 2 boxes because she ate them one at a time, and she was always there for at least an hour, and he had done the math. She did her homework on his work table while he inventoried supplies and sorted the repair requests that came in through the school office on small pink slips of paper. She asked questions about math. He gave her the shape of the answer and let her find it. She counted on her fingers. She got it right more often than not, and when she got it wrong, she didn't seem discouraged, just recalibrated, tried again. Donna picked her up every evening, still in her diner uniform, smelling of coffee and grease and effort. She thanked him every time. He told her every time that Laura was no trouble. She told him once that Laura talked about him at home, said he was the smartest man in the school, and Kenneth laughed and said she hadn't met the science teacher yet. The accident was on a Thursday afternoon in February. Black ice on the county road between the diner and the neighborhood where Donna rented a house with a leaking kitchen faucet and a landlord who didn't answer his phone. A delivery truck coming the other way. The roads had been borderline all day, and the diner manager had offered to let people leave early, and Donna had stayed because Donna was always the one who stayed. She didn't make it to the ambulance. Laura was in the supply closet when Principal Gary Young came to find her. Kenneth saw Gary's face in the doorway and understood before a single word was spoken. He had worn that face himself. He knew its exact weight. Gary said Laura's name softly. Said, "Come with me for a minute, sweetheart." Laura looked at Kenneth the way children look at the person they have decided to trust, asking without asking whether this was safe to do. Kenneth nodded. "Go ahead," he said. "I'll be right here." He stood outside the principal's office for 20 minutes and listened to a child learn that the person who had organized her entire world was gone. The sound she made was quiet. It was the sound of a grief that didn't have words yet, that was still trying to find its shape. When Gary came out, he told Kenneth that social services was on the way, and he'd called everyone on the emergency contact list, and no one was answering. Kenneth went in. Laura was sitting in the big chair behind the principal's desk, her feet not touching the floor, her homework still in her lap. Her face was wet. She had gone silent in the way of someone who has used up the first wave of tears and is waiting to understand what comes next. He pulled a chair close and sat beside her. "Mr. Kenneth." Her voice was very small. "Yeah, Laura, my mom died. I know, sweetheart. What's going to happen to me?" He didn't have a good answer. There was no good answer. There was only the true one. "You're going to be okay," he said. "How do you know?" "Because I'm going to make sure of it." He petitioned for custody that same week. He already knew the process. He filled out every form, answered every question, submitted to every home visit with the patience of a man who understood that the paperwork existed for good reasons, and that his understanding of those reasons did not exempt him from them. The caseworker was a young man who pointed out that Kenneth already had one child in his care and his income had not changed. Kenneth said he knew. He said Laura had been coming to his supply closet every afternoon for months, eating crackers, doing her homework, falling asleep on the plastic tub sometimes, and he'd carried her to the front office to wait for her mother twice. He said her mother was gone, and nobody had come. He said he wasn't asking whether it was practical. He was asking them to let him take her home. The caseworker looked at him for a long time. Then he started filling out the paperwork. Sandra was 2 when Laura moved in. Kenneth shifted Sandra's things to his room and gave Laura the second bedroom. Sandra fussed for one night about the disruption, and then stopped because Sandra adapted to things with a pragmatism that had been present in her since. The very first night in the supply closet, when she had assessed the situation and decided, apparently, that Kenneth would do. Laura was harder. She didn't speak for the first week. She sat at the table and looked at her plate. Kenneth made scrambled eggs every morning, because she had mentioned once, in passing, in the supply closet, that her mother always made scrambled eggs. He made them wrong. He put in too much butter and not enough milk, and they came out too soft and a little oily, and Laura ate them without complaint but without enthusiasm. On the 8th morning he came downstairs to find her standing at the stove with a spatula. "You do them wrong," she said. Not unkind, factual. "Mom always put milk in." He stood in the doorway and watched a 5-year-old teach him how to scramble eggs. "The milk," she explained, "went in after you cracked them into the bowl, not after they hit the pan, and you didn't put in so much butter, just a little, just to keep them from sticking." She demonstrated with the efficiency of someone passing on important knowledge under time pressure. They ate at the table together that morning. Laura in the metal folding chair, Kenneth in the oak one, in silence mostly. but she ate everything on her plate, and it was the first full meal she'd managed since the accident, and when she was done she said, "Thank you for the eggs, Kenneth," and carried her plate to the sink. He didn't say anything. He didn't want to make a moment out of it. It was just breakfast. That was enough. Stephanie arrived 3 years after Laura. Sandra was 4. Laura was 7. A Tuesday morning in June, hot already by 6 o'clock. The kind of early summer heat that made the basement of the school smell like old concrete and standing water. Kenneth was mopping the first floor hallway when he heard something from below. Not a pipe. Not the boiler cycling. Something heavier than either of those, with a weight to it that suggested a person rather than a machine. He opened the basement door and went down with his flashlight, behind the old boiler, in the gap between the furnace and the exterior wall, where the broken desks and the outdated textbooks and the other things the school didn't know what to do with were stacked. A girl was curled on the concrete floor. She was wearing long sleeves in June, in a basement where the temperature was already close to 80 degrees. She was 8 years old. He would not learn her name for another hour. What he learned first was the look in her eyes when his flashlight found her. Not fear, past fear. The look of someone who had been afraid so many times and for so long that they had moved through it into something quieter and more durable. A kind of waiting, not for rescue, just waiting to see what this would be. "Hey," he said. He kept his voice the way he kept his hands when he was working near a thing that might break. Careful, steady, not slow, just deliberate. "My name is Kenneth. I'm the custodian. Are you hurt?" She shook her head, a minimal movement. "Are you hungry?" She didn't answer, but her eyes moved to the thermos in his hand. "I've got coffee in this, probably not your thing, but let me go upstairs and get you something." He straightened up. "I'll be right back, I promise." She looked at him. The looks said she had heard promises before and had learned to discount them. He understood the look. He nodded at her once and went back up the stairs. He heated soup on the hot plate in the supply closet, the same one he used to warm Sandra's bottles in the early months. He got a blanket from the lost and found box. He went back down. She was still there. She had not moved an inch. He set the soup beside her. He draped the blanket over her shoulders. Then he sat down on the concrete floor, several feet away, and did not ask her anything. He did not move toward her. He sat, and he waited, the same way he waited for pipes to show him where the leak was, for floors to show him where the tile was lifting, for the building to tell him what it needed, if he was patient enough to listen. She picked up the soup after a while, drank it slowly, watching him over the edge of the can. "You don't have to tell me your name," he said. "You don't have to tell me anything." She drank the rest of the soup, set the can down, drew the blanket tighter. Then she closed her eyes. He called the police from the basement. They came and identified her as a child in a foster placement 2 miles from the school, a placement she had left 3 days earlier. When the officers asked to see her arms, Kenneth walked away to give her the privacy of that moment. He stood near the furnace with his back turned. When the officer came around the furnace to speak to him, the man's face had the look Gary Young's face had had the afternoon he came to tell Laura about her mother. Kenneth said nothing. He didn't need to. The foster family was arrested that afternoon. The girl was moved to an emergency placement. It didn't work. She wouldn't eat. She wouldn't speak. She kept asking the caseworker about the janitor at the school. 3 days later, the caseworker called Kenneth. She arrived with a garbage bag of clothes and a stuffed rabbit with one ear. She sat in the third chair, the blue stool Stephanie would later paint, which at that point was still its original unpainted wood, and she did not speak. Sandra sat beside her and colored in a coloring book, not addressing her, not looking at her directly, just sharing the space the way Sandra shared all spaces, with a calm self-possession that Kenneth had never taught her because he didn't know how to teach something he didn't fully understand. Laura brought a plate of scrambled eggs. The girl didn't eat them. For 2 weeks she moved through the house without making a sound. Kenneth did not push. He made meals and set her plate in front of her, and said nothing when she ate 3 bites, and said nothing when she ate nothing, and left the hallway, light on every night after he noticed she slept with her door open. He washed her clothes and folded them and left them on the chair in her room. He did not ask about her arms. He did not ask about where she'd come from, or what had happened, or what she needed. He just did the next thing, and the next, and let the steadiness of one day following another be its own form of information. 3 weeks in, he was making coffee at 6 in the morning and heard the floor creak behind him. She was standing in the doorway in pajamas that were too big, holding the stuffed rabbit by the ear he had left. "Mr. Kenneth Morning." She stood there. He poured his coffee and leaned against the counter and waited. "Can I stay here forever?" He set the mug down. He looked at her. He had learned, in the years since Daniel, that some moments were not improved by deliberation, that the right thing was simply to say it and let it be true. "Yeah," he said. "You can." He adopted her 4 months later. He asked her what she wanted to be called, and she said Stephanie. She liked Stephanie, it was hers. The first thing she did after the paperwork was final was ask if she could paint the wooden stool in the kitchen. He said, "What color?" She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about most things. "Blue," she said, "a good blue." He said, "All right." He said, "Don't forget to put newspaper down first." She did not forget. Those 3 chairs were full now. Sandra 28, Laura 30, Stephanie 27. A lawyer 2 months past her bar exam. A registered nurse in the cardiac ward at Millhaven General. A 3rd-grade teacher at the same school where Kenneth had spent 34 years keeping the building upright. 3 women who had arrived in his kitchen with nothing and left it with everything, or as close to everything as any of them could have calculated from the starting positions they'd been given. 3 women who were about to find out about the envelope on the table. Kenneth sat in the buzzing kitchen light and thought about Brian Thompson. The superintendent had arrived in Millhaven 18 months ago when Kenneth's predecessor retired. After a long tenure during which the district had run quietly and without incident, Thompson came with a reputation for efficiency, which turned out to mean something specific and not generally advertised. He wore pressed shirts. He spoke in the smooth cadences of someone who had learned that language was a surface you could polish. In his first month, he cut the maintenance budget, which was the kind of thing that looked like fiscal responsibility on a spreadsheet, and looked like peeling paint and broken heaters in an actual building. The strange thing was that the approved budget numbers kept going up. Kenneth would put in an order for paint, for light fixtures, for replacement tiles, and receive either less than he'd ordered or nothing at all, while the district's records showed the order as processed and fulfilled. He had noticed this because he noticed things. He wrote down everything he ordered in his spiral notebook, the way he had for 34 years, and when the supply delivery didn't match what he'd written, he noticed. He mentioned it to the new principal, a careful woman who listened to him and nodded and said she'd look into it. 2 weeks later, the white envelope appeared in his mailbox. He sat at the kitchen table in the buzzing light and understood, in the way you understand something when the understanding arrives whole rather than in pieces, that he had been chosen specifically, that his name had been useful to someone, that 34 years of requisition forms bearing his signature had made him available in a way no one had bothered to tell him about until it was too late to matter. The headlights swept across the kitchen window at 10:47. He heard the car door. The footsteps on the porch steps, quick and purposeful. He got up and opened the front door before she could knock. Sandra stood on the step, with a rolling suitcase and a leather bag over her shoulder. She was wearing a gray suit, the one she'd bought for interviews, and her dark hair was pulled back, and she had the look she got when she had already assessed a situation and moved past the part where feelings were the primary information. "You didn't have to come," he said. She walked past him into the kitchen, stopped when she saw the table, all of it spread out, the complaint, the itemized list, the purchase orders, with his name at the bottom, the pages and pages of numbers that added up to a story about him that was not true. She set her bag down. She pulled out the oak chair and sat in it. She picked up the first page and began to read, leaning forward slightly, one hand turning pages, the other flat on the table. She used to sit in exactly that position, doing her homework, while he mopped the floor in slow circles around her. He stood at the counter and watched her work and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say yet. That wasn't just noise. After 45 minutes she looked up. "Tell me everything," she said. Outside the kitchen window, at the end of the street, Clover Ridge Elementary stood dark and quiet in the autumn night. Kenneth had left it in good shape. He had always left it in good shape. That had always been the whole point. He pulled out the chair across from his daughter and sat down and started talking. Sandra did not sleep. Kenneth figured this out when he came downstairs at 5 in the morning and found her already at the table, his spiral notebook stacked in 2 columns in front of her, the lawsuit papers spread alongside them in a kind second grid she had constructed according to his logic that was entirely her own. She had been at it for hours. There was a coffee mug near her right hand that had gone cold enough to leave a ring on the table. She hadn't noticed or hadn't cared. The overhead light was on. The buzzing from the fluorescent ballast was gone. Because sometime in the night, apparently, she had gotten up on a chair and replaced it herself. And he didn't ask when because there was no point. He made fresh coffee. She kept working. "Kenneth," she didn't look up. "These notebooks, I know. No, I mean they're meticulous. Every repair, every supply order, every light bulb. That was the job. You tracked the gallon count on floor wax. You tracked individual ballasts by room number. If you do something every day," Kenneth said, and he poured 2 mugs and set one near her elbow, "you might as well do it right." She looked up at him then. Not with sentimentality, with the particular focus of someone who has just understood something that changes the shape of everything else. She set down the notebook she was holding and picked up a purchase order from the lawsuit pile and placed them side by side. "October. Your notebook says 12 gallons of floor wax ordered from the district supply account. The district's official record says 30. He looked. "I never ordered 30 gallons. We didn't use 30 gallons in a full season November. Your notebook says you replaced 4 fluorescent ballasts. Building records say 18. 4 classrooms needed ballasts. I replaced 4. I have the room numbers right there." Sandra laid her hands flat on the table on either side of the 2 documents, as though she was steadying herself or steadying the evidence or both. The first 20 years of records, she told him, were nearly a perfect match. His notebooks and the district files agreed on quantities, dates, vendor names, everything. Small discrepancies, the kind that came from rounding and human entry and nothing more. Then Brian Thompson arrived, and the numbers began to diverge. Slowly at first. An extra case of cleaning solution here. A few additional gallons of paint there. Then faster, wider, until by the final year the purchase orders showed 3 and 4 times what Kenneth had actually requested. "Where did the money go?" Kenneth said. "That's what I'm going to find out." The back door opened at 6:45, and Stephanie came through it the way she had always come through it, without knocking, because it was the back door, and the back door was not the kind of door you knocked on in a house where you had grown up. She was carrying her school tote bag and a manila folder, and she had the look of someone who had been awake for a while already and had used the time productively. She set the folder on the counter and looked at the table and looked at Kenneth and looked at Sandra. "I brought something," she said. Laura came through the front door at 7, still in her scrubs from the night shift, her hospital badge clipped to her chest pocket, her dark hair pulled back in the efficient bun she wore for work. She had driven straight from the hospital. She hadn't stopped home. She looked at the table, and then she walked to Kenneth and put her arms around him, and he held on a moment, longer than he normally would have, long enough for her to feel it, long enough for him to feel it back. All 3 chairs were full for the first time since the holidays. Kenneth stood at the counter and watched his daughter's work and understood that the white envelope in the district's certified mail had done something its author had not intended. It had put all 3 of them back in the same room. Stephanie opened the manila folder. She spread photographs across the table, 20, 30 of them, each one dated in her handwriting in the lower right corner. She had been documenting the building for months, she explained, because she had intended to file a formal complaint with the school board at the end of the academic year, when she had a full cycle of documentation. She had wanted to show a pattern, not just a series of incidents. She had wanted to be thorough. The photographs were thorough. The main hallway on the first floor, paint peeling from the drywall in sheets, large enough to take down with one pull. A classroom with a dead baseboard heater and an orange extension cord running from an outlet near the door to a small space heater in the corner. The kind of workaround that building code did not permit and common sense did not recommend. The upstairs bathroom, with the cracked sink basin that had been reported to the district maintenance office in September, in November, and again in January, each report acknowledged and then forgotten. The east side fire exit with the jammed handle, the blistered paint around the frame, the bolt that had been swollen shut since October and had not been freed since, which meant that the children in the classrooms nearest that door were operating on the assumption of an exit that did not function. I reported the fire door 3 times, Stephanie said. Her voice was level, but her jaw was tight in the way it got when she was containing something. I filled out the form on the district portal. I got confirmation emails. Nothing happened. Laura picked up one of the photographs and held it next to a purchase order from the lawsuit pile. She moved slowly, deliberately, with the careful attention she brought to reading a patient's chart. Stephanie, look at this one. The purchase order was from the previous March. It authorized payment to Meridian Supply for interior wall paint primer and application labor for the entire first-floor hallway. The amount was substantial. The vendor was listed as having completed the work. The photograph from the previous April showed the first-floor hallway with paint curling off the drywall in strips. The money was approved, Laura said. The vendor was paid. The work was never done. Sandra was already on her laptop. She had been for the past 20 minutes, moving between browser tabs with the focused efficiency of someone following a thread she had already decided to pull all the way through. She found what she was looking for just before 8 in the morning. And when she turned the screen so they could all see it, the kitchen went quiet in the way of a room where everyone has just understood the same thing at the same moment. Meridian Supply LLC, incorporated in the state 18 months ago. Registered business address, a suite number at a commercial mailbox facility in the county seat. Registered agent Timothy Clark. Sandra let that sit for a moment. Timothy Clark was Brian Thompson's brother-in-law, his wife's younger brother. He had no documented history in the construction or building supply industry. His previous business filings showed a lawn care operation that had been dissolved 2 years earlier for failure to file annual reports. Every inflated purchase order, Sandra said, was fulfilled by a company that didn't exist in any practical sense 18 months ago, and that company is owned by the superintendent's family. The room stayed quiet. Kenneth looked at the 2 columns on the table. His notebooks on one side, the districts on one side, records on the other. 34 years of what he had actually done lined up against what someone had needed people to believe he had done. He had signed his name to requisition forms as part of his job for 3 decades, and someone had found that signature useful in ways he had not consented to and could not have anticipated. He inflated my orders, Kenneth said. While you were still working, yes. Small amounts at first, enough to look like rounding errors or quantity adjustments. Then larger. Then after you retired, he kept going, using your name on the system because your account was still active and he had administrator access. And when I told the principal that the supply numbers weren't adding up, Sandra looked at him steadily. He filed a lawsuit accusing you of the exact crime he'd been committing, which made you look like the person raising a false flag to cover your own tracks. Kenneth sat with that. He turned it over. He was not a man given to anger in its loud and immediate form. What he felt was something quieter and more durable, a cold settling of facts into their correct arrangement, a recognition of what had been done and the specific shape of the intelligence behind it. It was not a simple scheme. It required patience. It required someone who understood that the safest way to steal from an institution was to make the stealing look like someone else's problem, before anyone looked closely enough to see the seams. "How much total?" he said. Sandra had already calculated it. $342,000. Based on what she could trace through the public business records and the purchase order documentation in the lawsuit materials. The lawsuit against Kenneth claimed $47,000, which was the portion attributable to activities that a reasonable person could plausibly connect to a custodian's role, small enough to be believable, large enough to ruin a reputation, precisely calibrated to land on the least powerful person in the sequence and stop there. "He didn't need to prove you took anything," Sandra said. "He needed to make you the story so that nobody looked at him." The morning after Sandra's discovery, Margaret Wilson drove to the house on Birch Street in a gray Volvo that had a dent in the rear quarter panel and a faded Millhaven Volunteer Fire Department sticker on the bumper that had been there since her husband put it there years ago. She was 70 years old, white-haired, and she wore a cardigan even in weather that didn't require one, because she had reached the age at which she dressed for her own comfort and not for the temperature. She carried a manila envelope. Gary Young had kept copies of everything he signed. This was a practice he had maintained for 40 years in education, born of the understanding that institutions had short memories and individuals sometimes needed to be their own documentation. Margaret had found the envelope in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in his study 3 days after Kenneth called her, because when Kenneth called and told her what was happening, she went directly to the filing cabinet because she had known something like this might come someday, and she had known where to look. The letter inside was on school district letterhead, signed by Gary Young in the careful cursive he had used his entire adult life, dated from the year Sandra was still in her first months in the supply closet, and it authorized Kenneth Lee to use the school kitchen, storage rooms, and facilities for personal purposes during non-school hours, effective immediately and without expiration, because Kenneth had been trying to pay the electric company directly for the electricity he used warming infant formula on the school hot plate, and Gary had called that unnecessary and embarrassing and put it in writing so Kenneth would stop asking. Sandra read it twice. She held it up to the kitchen light. She set it down carefully. "This covers the majority of what they're accusing you of," she said. "Using school resources for personal purposes. You had written authorization from the principal." "Gary said the same thing when he wrote it," Kenneth said. "He said I was being ridiculous, and if I brought up the electricity bill one more time, he was going to put it in writing and make me stop." "He did put it in writing. He did." Margaret Wilson looked at Kenneth from the oak chair across the table. The chair he had found at a garage sale for $4 and fixed with wood glue and a bicycle tube. The chair she had sat in for perhaps the first time in the 20-something years she had been coming to this kitchen for neighborhood events and school fundraisers and the occasional Sunday dinner when Gary was alive. "He always said you were the conscience of that school," she told Kenneth. "He said it more than once. He said if something was wrong with the building, you'd find it, and if something was wrong with the budget, you'd ask about it. And the day you asked about the budget is the day he expected something like this to happen." Kenneth looked at the letter. He looked at his notebooks. He looked at the 2 columns of evidence that were starting to look less like evidence against him and more like evidence of something else entirely. He knew, Kenneth said. He suspected, Margaret said. He didn't know how far it went. He passed before he could find out. She folded her hands in her lap. But he kept everything. He always kept everything. The settlement offer arrived on a Tuesday, 2 days before the trial. It came through the district's legal office, delivered to Sandra's temporary address at the house on Birch Street via certified mail, which was a deliberate choice, the kind of move that said we know where you are and we want you to feel the weight of that. The offer was precise. $5,000, payable within 30 days of signing. In exchange, Kenneth Lee would sign a statement acknowledging unauthorized use of district property and resources. The district would withdraw the civil complaint in its entirety. No admission of the larger accusations, no formal judgment, no public record beyond the statement itself. $5,000. His name next to the word unauthorized. A document that anyone who searched his name in a county database would find, and which said, in the language of official acknowledgement, that he had taken something that wasn't his. Kenneth stood in the kitchen with the offer in his hand and read it 3 times. Then he put it on the table and picked up his mop, which was standing in the corner near the door. Because he had been meaning to take it back to the garage and hadn't gotten around to it, he started mopping the kitchen floor. The floor was clean. He mopped it anyway. It was what his hands knew how to do when his head was working hand through something that didn't have a clean resolution bus. Sandra watched him from the table where she'd been reading the offer. She watched him mop the clean floor in the pattern he had used his whole working life, left to right in overlapping arcs. The same motion, the same pace, the same unhurried deliberateness. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "When I was a 3rd year at law school, I wanted to quit." He kept mopping. "Not just wanted to. I called you from a parking garage at 11 at night and told you I was done. I had the withdrawal forms open on my laptop. I was going to go home to Millhaven and figure out something else." He remembered the call. He remembered the parking garage because she had mentioned it. The particular echo of her voice. The particular echo of her voice, the way she had sounded like a person at the edge of something they were genuinely prepared to step off. He had sat at this kitchen table and listened to her lay out every reason it made sense to stop. And she had been right about most of them. The debt was real. The exhaustion was real. The feeling of not belonging in rooms designed for people whose parents had been there before them was real. And he knew it was real because he had felt it himself in the courthouse the day he sat in the ill-fitting suit and asked a judge to let him keep a baby he had found in a cardboard box. He had not told her it would be fine. He had not told her the hard thing would get easier if she just pushed through. He had told her the truth, which was simpler and more durable than either of those things. "You finish what you start," he said, still mopping, not looking up. "The easy road and the right road aren't the same road. That's what you said." "I meant it. I know you did it." Sandra's hands were flat on the table, not moving. "All 3 of us. Every time any of us has been at a point where stopping was the easier thing, that's the thing you've said. In different words sometimes, but always that." He stopped mopping. He stood with the mop handle in his hands and looked at the clean floor and the table with the settlement offer on it, and his daughter sitting in the chair her mother never sat in a kitchen that had held more of his life than any other room he had ever occupied. "It comes with a statement," he said. "I know. My name next to unauthorized. I know what it comes with. $5,000 and they walk away, and I sign something that says I did something I didn't do." Sandra looked at him steadily. Her voice was quiet and very clear. "You taught us that the easy road and the right road are not the same road. Don't let this be the time you take the other one." He looked at the offer for a long moment. He thought about what it would mean to sign it. He thought about what it would mean to his daughters. Not in the immediate sense, but in the long one, the sense that ran 30 years forward into futures he would not be present for, where they would carry whatever he did here as information about what a person did when the accounting became difficult. He thought about Gary Young, keeping copies of 40 years of documents in a filing cabinet because he believed that honest records were their own form of protection. He thought about 34 spiral notebooks stacked on a kitchen table. "Turn it down," he said. That night, Kenneth stood at the kitchen sink rinsing the dinner dishes. The water was warm. The kitchen was quiet the way it got when everyone had gone to their rooms, but no one had actually gone to sleep. He could hear Stephanie moving around upstairs. The particular creak of the floor above the kitchen that he had been meaning to fix for 15 years. He could hear the low murmur of Laura on the phone in the guest room. probably with the hospital, probably covering something for a colleague who had called in. He rinsed the last mug and set it in the rack, and the pressure came. Not sharp, not sudden, nothing that announced itself as an emergency. A slow bloom of weight across his chest, center left, settling against his sternum like something, being pressed from the inside out. He put both hands on the edge of the sink, held himself steady, counted. 7 seconds, 10, 15. It released, not dramatically, the way a muscle releases, after you stop asking it to hold something too heavy. A gradual easing that left a ghost of itself behind. He exhaled. He turned the water back on and rinsed the drain. How long? Laura was in the doorway. She was not in her scrubs anymore. She had changed into the worn gray sweatshirt she kept in the guest room closet, the one with the Millhaven General logo that had mostly faded from washing. She was not holding her phone. She was watching him, with the particular quality of attention she brought to her work. The attention that did not panic and did not look away and did not require you to perform being all right when you weren't. He did not ask how she knew. She was a cardiac ward nurse. She had probably been watching him since dinner. Few months, he said. She didn't move from the doorway. How many episodes? 4, maybe 5. Duration? 10, 15 seconds. Pressure? Not sharp, shortness of breath sometimes. Once some dizziness. Laura looked at the ceiling for a moment, in the way she did when she was organizing information and not wanting the person in front of her to see her organizing it. Then she looked back at him. "You're going to a doctor tomorrow." Laura. "Tomorrow, Kenneth." Not a question, not a negotiation. After the courthouse. "First appointment I can get you." He leaned against the counter. He looked at her. She was 30 years old, standing in a doorway in a faded sweatshirt, and she had the same eyes she'd had at 5 years old on an upturned plastic tub, eating saltines one at a time, the same quality of attention, the same refusal to be moved by the thing you said when you didn't mean it. "I didn't want you girls to worry," he said. "You had enough going on." She came into the kitchen then. She walked to where he was standing and stopped in front of him, close. The way you stood when you needed someone to actually hear what you were saying and not just receive the sound of it. "Our lives started because you worried about us," she said. "Every single one of us is standing here because you worried enough to do something about it. You worried about a baby in a cardboard box. You worried about a 5-year-old eating crackers on a plastic tub because her mother was still at work. You worried about a girl hiding in a basement who had stopped expecting anything good." She held his gaze and did not let it go. "You don't get to tell us not to worry about you." He looked at her for a long time. "Tomorrow," he said, "after the courthouse." The morning of the trial, Kenneth was up at 4:30. Because he was always up at 4:30, the hour so deeply worn into him that his body kept it even on weekends and holidays, and the 2 occasions in 34 years when he had actually been sick enough to stay home. He put on the Navy suit. He found the same tie he had worn to both custody hearings and every graduation the girls had ever had, a dark blue with a thin stripe that had been Sandra's idea the morning of Laura's high school ceremony when she had stood behind him at the bathroom mirror and said that one, "It goes with everything." He had worn it every formal occasion since. He stood in the bathroom and looked at the mirror and understood that he was 68 years old, and the suit still didn't fit and probably never would, and that was all right. Sandra was at the table when he came down, dressed and ready, her notes arranged in 3 folders that she had organized and reorganized the night before until the arrangement satisfied some standard only she fully understood. Laura came downstairs in a dark blouse and pressed slacks, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone long accustomed to being functional before dawn. Stephanie came last, in the cardigan she wore for parent-teacher conferences, carrying the folder of photographs and the thermal coffee mug she had gotten from the school during Teacher Appreciation Week and used for everything. Nobody said much in the car. Laura drove. Sandra read through her notes in the passenger seat, one hand moving across the pages in the small concentrated gestures of someone going over something they already know and checking it anyway. Stephanie sat in the back with Kenneth and looked out the window at Millhaven. Going by in the early morning, the diner, where Donna Jackson had worked double shifts, the church on the corner, with the broken gutter he had fixed one spring without being asked, the school at the far end of the district that had been his building for most of his adult life, and didn't belong to him in any legal sense, and never had and still felt, in some way he couldn't have properly articulated, like something he was responsible for. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building on the county road. They parked on the street and walked toward the glass entrance doors. Kenneth was looking at the building, at the brick, and the flag, and the brass handles on the doors. And then the doors resolved into transparency, and he saw what was on the other side of them. The hallway was full, not crowded in the way of a busy municipal building, the ordinary traffic of people with forms to file and fees to pay, and appointments to keep, full in the way of people who had come specifically, who had arrived with purpose, who were standing along both walls and filling the wooden benches, and occupying every available piece of floor space between the entrance and the courtroom doors. He recognized faces. The woman who lived 3 houses down and had called him one Sunday morning because a pipe had burst in her basement, and he had driven over in his truck while it still had a truck and fixed it, and refused the check she tried to write him. The man whose son had spent a whole winter sitting in the supply closet after school because his mother worked late and the after-school program was full, and Kenneth had never made it a thing, had just let the boy sit there and read and leave when his mother texted. The retired teacher who had been at Clover Ridge for 18 years alongside Kenneth, who had made the school band play backdrop with him every December, who had showed up one January morning to find her classroom heater working again because Kenneth had come in on a Saturday to fix it before the new week started. Margaret Wilson near the courtroom door with her manila envelope. Others he knew, and others he half knew, and others he knew only as the faces of people whose children had moved through the building he had spent 34 years keeping upright. He stopped walking. Stephanie touched his arm. He looked at Sandra, who was watching him with an expression that was careful and steady and allowed him to feel whatever he needed to feel without asking him to name it. "They came for you," she said. He didn't know what to do with that. He walked through the hallway, and people reached for him, not grabbing, not dramatic, just a brief contact of hands that wanted to indicate presence, a touch on the shoulder, a grip on the arm, a voice low enough not to carry saying, "We're with you. We know, this is wrong. We came." He nodded back. He kept walking. He didn't know how to receive it gracefully, so he received it quietly, which was the only way he knew to receive most things. The courtroom was smaller than the ones on television, wood paneling that had been refinished at least once since it was installed. Fluorescent lights, a different model than the ones at the school, but the same institutional logic. Rows of benches that were filling from the back forward. Kenneth sat at the defense table in his navy suit with his 3 folders of evidence, and 62 spiral notebooks in a cardboard box on the floor beside his chair, and Sandra sat next to him with her own folders, and Patricia Johnson, the Millhaven attorney, who had agreed to supervise the case as a professional courtesy and because the situation made her angry in the particular way that situations involving the abuse of institutional power made her angry, sat at the end of the table and watched the room fill. Across the aisle, Thompson's attorney was already seated, an efficient man in an expensive suit named Richard Miller, who had driven up from the city and brought 2 assistants and a rolling cart of documents. Thompson sat beside him, pressed shirt, as always. Hands folded, he did not look at Kenneth. He looked at the papers in front of him, with the focused attention of a man trying to appear calmer than he was. Kenneth looked at him. He looked for a long time. He thought about the afternoon 18 months ago, when he had walked into the principal's office and explained carefully and without accusation that the supply deliveries weren't matching his order records, that he had been tracking this for several months, that he was not raising an alarm, but he wanted someone with more access to the system to look at the numbers. He thought about the 2 weeks between that conversation and the white envelope. He thought about the deliberateness of that timing. He thought about the particular kind of person who, when faced with being seen, reaches for the most available weapon and uses it on the nearest available target. He thought about Gary Young keeping copies of 40 years of documents. He thought about 34 spiral notebooks. He thought about a piece of lined paper safety pinned to a blue blanket with yellow ducks on it. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Kenneth's knees cracked on the way up, and Sandra glanced at him, and he looked back at her steadily to indicate he was fine, which he needed to be for the next several hours. The judge was a woman named Elizabeth Jones. Late 50s, gray at the temples, reading glasses hanging on a chain she had not yet put on. She settled into her chair and opened the case file, and looked at both tables, and looked at both tables with the expression of someone who had heard many things in this room and would hear more before the morning was out. This is the civil complaint filed by the Millhaven County School District against Kenneth Lee, alleging misappropriation of district resources. Counsel, are both parties prepared? Richard Miller said they were. Sandra stood and said they were. Her voice was the same voice she had used at 5 years old, asking Kenneth questions about arithmetic, while he sorted supply orders, clear and precise and without unnecessary decoration. Patricia Johnson sat at the end of the table and watched her and said nothing and did not need to. Kenneth watched Sandra stand in the courtroom and speak, and he thought about a cardboard box in the corner of a gymnasium, and about the 5 words on the piece of paper, and about the weight of a baby in his palm on a cold morning 24 years ago. Miller went first. He was a competent attorney and a professional, which meant he told a coherent story using the available materials, and the available materials, taken in isolation, told a story that could have been believed. 2 decades of purchase orders bearing Kenneth Lee's name. Quantities that exceeded the building's documented needs. Materials ordered and paid for that did not appear in the building's inventory records. A pattern, he said, of a trusted employee who had leveraged access over a long period of time for personal benefit. He did not mention Meridian Supply. He did not mention Timothy Clark. He did not mention the dates, the purchase orders, filed after Kenneth's retirement. He spoke for 48 minutes and sat down. Sandra stood up. She had been sitting with her notes on the table in front of her through the entirety of Miller's presentation. She had not written anything on her legal pad. She had listened with the still attention of someone storing information, rather than reacting to it. When she stood, she did not pick up the notes. She left them where they were. "Your Honor," she said, "I'm going to begin with a simple factual question, and I'd ask that counsel for the plaintiff note that I intend to return to it." She looked at the district's accountant, whom Miller had called as his first witness, and who was still in the witness box. "You've reviewed all of the purchase orders submitted as evidence in this complaint." The accountant confirmed that she had. "Can you tell the court the dates of the most recent 6 purchase orders on that list?" The accountant read them, 3 from the spring of the previous year, 2 from the fall before that, 1 from the prior January. "Thank you. And the date of Mr. Lee's retirement from the school district." A pause. Then the date, read from the file. "So the most recent 6 purchase orders submitted as evidence of Mr. Lee's alleged misappropriation were filed after the date of his retirement." The accountant looked at the documents. "They bear his name and his recorded signature." "Yes, that wasn't my question." "Were they filed after the date of his retirement from district employment?" A longer pause. "Yes. So we are being asked," Sandra said, and her voice had not changed in pitch or pace or temperature, "to accept as evidence of this man's wrongdoing a series of documents filed under his name through a system he was no longer employed to access, bearing a signature he did not apply." She let that sit. "I'd like to move to the evidence we're submitting." She spent the next hour and 10 minutes dismantling the case with the methodical care of someone who had been building this counter-argument for 72 hours, without sleeping enough, and was not going to rush it now that she was here. The spiral notebooks, all 62 of them, entered into evidence as Exhibit A through Exhibit A62, each one dated and intact, each one showing Kenneth's actual orders against the district's inflated records. The gap between what he had ordered and what the district claimed he had ordered, rendered in a table Sandra had prepared on a single clean page, was stark. Meridian Supply LLC, its incorporation date, its registered agent, and the family relationship between Timothy Clark and Brian Thompson entered the record next. Sandra had obtained the incorporation documents through a public records request filed the morning after she first found the company name. The documents were unremarkable in themselves. Their significance was in their timing and their connections, and Sandra laid those out without editorial comment, one fact following the next, in the particular logical sequence of someone who understands that the strongest arguments do not announce themselves. The photographs Stephanie had taken went in as the final element, each one dated, each one showing a specific area of the building, a specific condition, each one cross-referenced to a purchase order, showing a payment made to Meridian Supply for work in that area during the period. The photograph documented the hallway that had been paid to be painted and had not been painted, the heater that had been paid to be replaced and had not been replaced, the fire door that had been paid to be repaired and had not been repaired, $342,000 in approved expenditures. A building that showed none of them. Elizabeth Jones looked at the photographs for a long time. She looked at the Meridian Supply documents. She looked at the table Sandra had prepared showing the numerical discrepancies. Then she looked at Miller, who was writing something on his legal pad with the focused attention of a man buying time. Sandra called her witnesses in order. The neighbor with her handwritten list of every repair Kenneth had made on the street over 28 years. Never accepting payment, never making it an occasion, just showing up when something needed doing and doing it. The woman whose daughter's backpack Kenneth had repaired every week for an entire school year, leaving it on the hook outside the supply closet every Monday morning, fixed, ready, because he had noticed the strap breaking and had fixed it the first time, and then continued to fix it because it kept breaking and because nobody asked him to stop. The retired teacher who described 15 consecutive December evenings of Kenneth building school play, sets after hours, sets that the budget didn't cover and that the children required and that Kenneth did not consider optional. Laura took the stand. She described saltines and arithmetic and a 5-year-old's explanation of the correct way to scramble eggs. And she described standing in a principal's office at 5 years old learning that her mother was gone. And she described what it was to have someone say you're going to be okay and to mean it and to prove it every day after that for 25 years. Stephanie took the stand. She described a basement floor and a flashlight and a can of soup and a man who sat several feet away and asked nothing and waited for as long as she needed him to wait. And she described asking one morning if she could stay forever and hearing a yes that sounded like something that had already been decided, like something the question was only catching up to. Miller objected to the testimony as irrelevant to the financial complaint. Elizabeth Jones overruled him and did not explain why, which in Kenneth's experience was what judges did when they had decided something and considered the reasoning obvious. Then the judge looked at Kenneth. "Mr. Lee, would you like to address the court?" He stood up. He went to the front. He stood at the railing because the witness box felt too contained for what he needed to say, and nobody told him to move. And so he stood where he was. He looked at the courtroom, the faces on the benches, the 3 chairs in the front row where his daughters were sitting, none of those chairs matching each other, which struck him only in that moment as something worth noticing. He looked at Thompson, who was looking at his papers. He looked at Elizabeth Jones, who was looking at him. "Your Honor," he said, "I'm not a lawyer. I'm a custodian. I mopped floors and fixed pipes and changed light bulbs for 34 years, and I was proud to do it. I didn't take anything from that school. Everything I ordered went into that building. I kept records because I believe that if you do a job right, you should be able to prove it." He stopped. He looked at the front row. "People ask me, over the years, why I took on children I couldn't afford. They were right about the numbers. I didn't have the money. I didn't have the space. I didn't have a plan." He gripped the railing. "But you don't raise children by having enough. You raise them by showing up. I showed up every day for those girls. I showed up every day for that school." That's what I have to say. The pressure arrived as he finished the last sentence. The same pressure, the same location, the same slow weight against his sternum. He held the railing. His vision went slightly wrong at the edges, the courtroom gaining a faint shimmer at the periphery. He counted. He kept his face arranged. He let go of the railing and straightened up and looked at the judge. That's all he said. He walked back to the table. He sat down. Laura in the front row had gone very still in the way of a person who has seen something and is processing the implications while keeping every other part of themselves motionless. He met her eyes for a moment. He looked away. Sandra's hand found his under the table and held it. He let it. The judge asked the attorneys to approach the bench, and they stood there for several minutes in the low murmur of a conversation that didn't reach the gallery. Miller shook his head at one point. Elizabeth Jones did not change her expression. Sandra kept her hands clasped in front of her, and her eyes on the judge, and did not look at Miller at all. When they returned to their tables, the room was very quiet. Thompson leaned toward Miller and said something that didn't carry. Miller wrote something on his pad and slid it back. Thompson read it. His jaw tightened in the way of someone receiving information they have already been told to expect and haven't made peace with. Miller stood. "Your Honor, the plaintiff wishes to withdraw the civil complaint." The room moved, not loudly, the particular sound of 50 people adjusting their understanding of what was happening. Sandra was on her feet before the sound finished. "Your Honor, given the evidence presented today regarding the financial records of Meridian Supply and its relationship to district administration, we would ask that the court order the preservation of all relevant district financial documents and refer the matter to the county prosecutor's office for review." Elizabeth Jones looked at Sandra. She looked at the document table. She looked at Thompson, who was looking at the wall behind the judge's bench with the focused attention of someone who has decided to be very still. "The complaint against Kenneth Lee is dismissed with prejudice." Her voice was even and final, the voice of a door closing. "I am additionally ordering the preservation of all district financial records for the past 3 fiscal years, pending independent audit, and I am referring the evidence presented today to the county prosecutor for review of potential financial misconduct involving public funds." She removed her glasses. She looked at Thompson. "This court takes the misuse of public resources seriously. All parties should conduct themselves accordingly." Thompson's attorney was already gathering papers. Thompson himself stood, buttoned his jacket, with 2 precise movements, and walked out of the courtroom. He did not look at Kenneth. He did not look at Sandra. He did not look at Sandra. He did not look at the gallery full of people who had given up a morning to be in a room where someone they believed in could feel that they believed in him. Kenneth sat at the defense table and looked at the wood grain in front of him. He looked at his hands. He looked at the box of 62 spiral notebooks on the floor beside his chair. "Kenneth," Sandra's voice was quiet. "Just his name. It's done." He nodded. He couldn't say anything yet. He was working through the particular kind of relief that doesn't feel like relief right away. That feels first like the absence of something you'd been carrying so long you'd stopped noticing the weight. Laura came through the gate in the railing first. Then Stephanie. Then Sandra, who put her arms around him from the left side and held on with the strength of someone who had been holding themselves very controlled for a very long time and was now permitted to stop. He stood in the courtroom with his 3 daughters and pressed his face against the top of Sandra's head and felt the room around them begin, very slowly, to belong to a different kind of mourning. The hallway outside the courtroom was still full when Kenneth walked through it. The crowd had not left during the proceedings. They had stood in the corridor for the better part of 3 hours. which was not a small thing, which was the kind of thing that required a person to decide in the morning that this mattered enough to give a Tuesday to, and then hold that decision through. The waiting. They had waited. They were still there when the courtroom doors opened and the word moved through the hallway. The way. Words move through rooms full of people who have been holding their breath, not as an announcement but as a release. A collective exhale that changed the temperature of the air. The neighbor with the handwritten list caught Kenneth's arm. Her name was Barbara Garcia, 71 years old, and she had lived 3 houses down from him since before Sandra could walk, and she said, I told you they'd see it. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said he appreciated her coming, which was true but insufficient, which she seemed to understand, because she patted his arm and let him go. The man from the diner, who had worked the grill for 23 years, and had known Donna Jackson, and had watched Kenneth brings 3 small girls in for pancakes on Sunday mornings, and had started putting extra pancakes on their plates without comment, shook Kenneth's hand with both of his and said pancakes were on him this Sunday. All 4 of them. He wouldn't hear otherwise. Margaret Wilson held his hand in both of hers, in the doorway, and did not say anything and did not need to. The letter her husband had written was already in Sandra's file folder. It had done its work. Gary Young had kept everything, and it had been enough, which was the thing Gary had believed about documentation, his entire professional life, and which had turned out to be correct in a way he had not lived to see confirmed. Kenneth moved through the hallway, the way he moved through most spaces, quietly, a little stooped, uncertain what to do with the attention. Sandra's hand was on his back guiding him forward, so he would not stop moving entirely, because left to his own momentum he would have found a wall and stood near it and waited for the crowd to thin. At the courthouse steps he stopped and looked back at the building. All those years, he said, and his voice came out lower than he expected, rougher, carrying something he hadn't anticipated needing to say out loud. That's the first time I've been in a courthouse for myself. Sandra heard him. She came to stand beside him, not touching, just present in the way she had always been present, the way that asked nothing of him and offered everything. You did well in there. I didn't do anything. You did it a long time ago, she said. Today was just the accounting. He thought about that on the ride home, in the back seat with Stephanie, while Laura drove and Sandra organized her files in the passenger seat. He thought about the idea that the things a person does over decades could accumulate into something large enough to stand up in a courtroom. He had not been keeping the notebooks as protection. He had been keeping them because that was how he did the job, carefully and completely, because the job deserved that, because the building deserved that, because the children in the building deserved a custodian who took seriously the work of keeping the place they spent there days safe and functional and dignified. He had not been building a case. He had been being himself, consistently, for 34 years, and it turned out those were the same thing. The follow-up arrived in pieces over the weeks that followed, and each piece was its own kind of conclusion. 3 weeks after the dismissal, the district announced that Brian Thompson had been placed on administrative leave without pay, pending the results of an independent audit requested by the county prosecutor's office. The announcement was brief and bureaucratic, and said nothing about Kenneth or the lawsuit or the photographs. Stephanie had taken over months of patient documentation. It mentioned irregularities in vendor contracting procedures, which was a phrase designed to communicate the minimum required information, while protecting the institution's interest in appearing to have caught the problem itself rather than having been forced to confront it by a retired custodian's daughter in a courtroom. Kenneth read the announcement online on his laptop at the kitchen table. He read it twice. He closed the laptop and did not say much about it. Stephanie called that evening from her apartment. "Did you see it?" "I saw it. How do you feel?" He thought about it honestly. Like someone opened a window, he said. Not like winning, more like the room can breathe again. She was quiet for a moment. "That's exactly right," she said. "That's exactly what it feels like." The audit results came 5 weeks after the complaint's dismissal. The independent firm the prosecutor retained went through 3 years of district financial records with the thoroughness that public scrutiny makes possible when someone has already done the preliminary work of identifying where to look. The confirmed number was $342,000, which matched what Sandra had calculated from the available documents the morning after. She arrived with her rolling suitcase. Meridian Supply LLC had received payment for work that had not been performed, materials that had not been delivered, and services that had no documentation of completion beyond the purchase orders themselves, orders that bore Kenneth's name on a digital system maintained by a man who understood that the easiest way to hide what you were doing was to make it look like something someone else was already doing. Timothy Clark, Thompson's brother-in-law, hired his own attorney within 48 hours of the audit results becoming public, and was cooperating with the prosecutor's office within a week. The cooperation was the kind that comes from a person who has calculated that the distance between their involvement and the center of the crime is their most negotiable asset. He provided records, communications, and account documentation. The picture that emerged was detailed, complete, in the way of things that were always complete, that had always been complete, that were only waiting for someone to look at them from the right angle. Criminal charges were filed against Thompson in the 7th week after the dismissal. Fraud, misuse of public funds. A 3rd count related to the filing of a civil complaint containing evidence the prosecution characterized as manufactured. Kenneth learned about the 3rd count from Sandra, who called him on a Wednesday morning to tell him, and who noted without emphasis that the phrase manufactured evidence was the prosecutor's characterization, not hers, and that she had simply presented what the records showed, and that the records had done the rest. "You don't need to thank me," she said before he could. "I know that," he said. "I'm going to anyway." Kenneth, Sandra. A pause, and then she laughed, and it was the laugh she had had since she was small, sudden and complete, and he had not heard it in the weeks since the trial, because there had not been much to laugh about, and hearing it now in the phone, pressed to his ear in the quiet kitchen, was something he filed carefully away in the place where he kept the things he didn't want to forget. Laura drove him to the doctor's appointment the morning after the trial, as agreed. Sandra sat in the waiting room with her legal pad and worked while she waited, which was how Sandra sat in any room that required waiting. Stephanie arrived 40 minutes in, having arranged a substitute for her morning class, and sat beside Sandra and worked on her lesson plan for the following week. The examination took most of the morning. Dr. James Smith was a primary care physician, of the sort that had been practicing in Millhaven for many years. A man of Kenneth's general generation who had watched this town change in some ways and not change in others, and had opinions about both that he kept to himself unless asked. He ran an EKG and blood work and a stress test, and he brought Kenneth into his office that afternoon to deliver results in the direct manner of someone who respects the person they are speaking to enough not to dress things up beyond recognition. "Stable angina," he said. The EKG showed some changes consistent with reduced blood flow during exertion. Not a heart attack, not imminent danger, but a condition that required management and monitoring, and the taking seriously that Kenneth had not been doing. There were medications that would help. There were adjustments to make. He wanted to see Kenneth every 6 weeks for the first year. "You should have come in sooner," he said. "I was busy," Kenneth said. Dr. Smith looked at the 3 women arranged along the wall of the examination room. He had the expression of a man assembling information. "Busy doing what, exactly?" Laura answered for him. "Being stubborn," she said. He drove home with a prescription, 2 follow-up cards, a printed sheet of dietary modifications, and a weekly pill organizer that Sandra produced from her bag in the parking lot outside the clinic. She said she had bought it the week before. He asked when she had known he would need it. She said she hadn't known for certain. She had just known him, which amounted to the same thing. He looked at the organizer. 7 compartments, one for each day of the week, with the day printed on each lid in clean block letters. She had already written his name on a piece of tape along the bottom edge. "I've been putting mine off too," Stephanie said from the back seat. "Dental. I'm calling when we get home." "That's different," Kenneth said. "It's the same conversation," Laura said. "I've been having it with patients my entire career. Nobody takes care of themselves when there are other things to take care of. And then the other things are fine and they've let themselves go." She glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You don't get to fall apart once we don't need you to hold everything together." He looked at the pill organizer in his hands. He thought about the pressure in his chest in the courtroom during the last sentence, of what he'd had to say, and the way he had gripped the railing and counted and let it pass and finished anyway. He thought about how Laura had gone very still in the front row when she saw it. He thought about what it cost a person to stay still when they were watching something that alarmed them, and what it said about the quality of her training and the quality of her character that she had held herself that way until the right moment. He started taking the medication that evening. The school board met in the 3rd week of the audit process and voted on a series of resolutions that addressed the maintenance backlog the audit had revealed. The recovered funds, most of them, would be directed to Clover Ridge Elementary, to the building where the money had been collected, under false pretenses and from which it had been diverted for 3 years. Contractors came in on a Monday in early spring. Kenneth did not go to watch. He had left that building in good shape when he retired. And he did not need to see its current condition to know what it had become in his absence. He knew from Stephanie's photographs. He knew from the way she talked about teaching a full school day in a room where the heater had been broken since November. Stephanie called him on the Friday of the 1st week of renovation. She called from the window of her classroom, she said, because she could see the contractors in the parking lot unloading the new baseboard heater units, and she wanted him to know. He asked her how the room was. "Cold," she said. "Still cold. They're starting Monday. Monday's soon." 2 days, she said. "I've been wearing my coat inside since October. 2 days is fast from where I'm standing." He asked her what the 3rd graders thought of all the activity, the contractors and the equipment, and the general disruption of having their school in a state of visible change. She said they were fascinated. She said 8-year-olds treated construction equipment the way previous generations had treated traveling circuses, with a reverence bordering on the religious. She said one of her students had asked if the school was getting a swimming pool. And she had explained about heaters, and the boy had looked at her with the polite disappointment of someone who has received technically acceptable news and chosen to say nothing further about it. Kenneth laughed. He had not laughed at something small and unimportant for a while, and the sensation of it was pleasant in the way of things that have been temporarily unavailable and then return. Sandra called on the 1st Sunday of each month, the same as she always had, but the conversations were longer now. She had taken the legal aid position. The announcement came on a Thursday evening, delivered to him by phone in the matter-of-fact tone she used for information she had already decided, and was reporting rather than proposing. 3 law firms had offered her positions, she said, all of them in the city, all of them with salaries that would have addressed her student loan situation in a serious way. Inside of 5 years, he waited. "I took the legal aid office," she said, "Millhaven. Starting the 1st of next month." He asked what that paid. "Less," she said. "How much less?" "Considerably." A pause. "I'm not going to be buying a house anytime soon." He thought about what to say and found that there wasn't much that needed saying, which was the sign of a decision that had been made well. She had told him, not asked him. She had already done the work of deciding, and now she was telling him the outcome, which was the mode she had always used for the things she was certain about. "There are people sitting in their kitchens right now," she said, with a white envelope on the table and no phone call coming. "People who did everything right and can't afford to prove it. People who are going to sign settlement agreements they shouldn't sign. Because the alternative is a courtroom that requires a lawyer they don't have. Her voice was precise and even, and carried the particular weight of someone articulating something they have been thinking about for a long time and are finally saying out loud. You didn't raise us to do the easier thing when the right thing was there to do. He sat with that for a moment. No, he said, I didn't, so she let that be the end of it. He said he was proud of her, which he knew she didn't need to hear, because Sandra had never required external commission of her choices, but which, he said, anyway, because it was true, and because the truth didn't diminish in value from being spoken. The school board's renovation resolution included a line item he was not told about until Stephanie handed him an envelope over Sunday dinner in April. She handed it to him without comment and sat back down and put her napkin in her lap and began serving herself roast chicken with the focused attention of someone who is concentrating very hard on not watching the person across the table. He opened the envelope. It was an invitation printed on cardstock with the Clover Ridge Elementary logo in the upper left corner. The Millhaven County School Board cordially invited Kenneth Lee to the dedication ceremony for the newly renovated school facilities, to be held on the first Saturday of June at 10 in the morning. At the bottom of the card, below the RSVP information, a single additional line, the Kenneth Lee Gymnasium will be formally dedicated at this event. He read it twice. He set it down. Absolutely not, he said. Stephanie reached for the green beans, already decided. They are not putting my name on a gymnasium. Laura poured water into her glass. It's a plaque. Small one. By the door. I don't want my name on a plaque either. Sandra, across the table, cut a piece of chicken with the efficient economy of someone who has decided this conversation has a predetermined outcome and is simply waiting for it to arrive. They already made it. He looked at all three of them. They looked back at him with the collective patience of people who had learned over many years that certain of his objections were genuine, and certain of them were the kind that required being waited out. They had become expert at distinguishing between the two. I am a custodian, he said. You were a custodian, Laura said. Now you are a retired custodian, whose name is on the gymnasium at Clover Ridge Elementary, which they will continue to call the Kenneth Lee Gymnasium, regardless of whether you attend the ceremony. He opened his mouth. The plaque is already mounted, Stephanie said. She had clearly been saving this. I saw it Tuesday. It looks good. He closed his mouth. The first Saturday of June arrived cool and bright, the kind of morning that apologizes for the winter by being better than it needs to be. Kenneth put on the navy suit. He stood in the bathroom mirror and understood that he was going to stop describing this suit as not fitting, because it had now attended more significant events in his life than any other piece of clothing he owned, and it had done its job at all of them, which was the relevant standard. He put on the tie Sandra had chosen at Laura's graduation. He went downstairs. Laura drove. The parking lot at the school was fuller than Kenneth had seen it on a non-school day since the Christmas concert 10 years before the budget cuts eliminated the Christmas concert. He recognized the cars of teachers, of parents, of people who had no connection to the school but had a connection to him, which was becoming. He understood a distinction without much practical difference. They walked across the parking lot and through the main entrance, which had a new set of door handles, brushed nickel, replacing the ones that had been sticking since he was still employed. He noticed the handles first because listening hardware was a habit that did not go away with retirement. Then he noticed the hallway. The first floor hallway was painted, clean, even, the warm off-white he had used when he painted it himself, on 2 separate occasions on his own weekends, the color that made the space feel less institutional. The fluorescent fixtures overhead were new, the kind that didn't buzz, that produced light without also producing a low-level irritation. The floor tiles had been replaced where the old ones had been lifting, and the new ones were set flush and sealed, and he ran his foot lightly along the edge of one to test the seam and found it solid. He stood in the hallway for a moment and let himself look. A teacher he had worked alongside for 20 years came up and shook his hand and said the building felt like itself again, which was exactly the right way to put it, which was why this particular teacher had been excellent at explaining things to children for 20 years. The gymnasium had been refinished. He walked in slowly. The floor had been sanded down to bare wood and resealed, and the crack that had been running from the free throw line to the far baseline since a bad winter 9 years ago had been filled and sanded smooth, and was visible only as a faint seam if you knew where to look and looked at the right angle in the right light. The new lighting overhead was even and bright, without the institutional harshness of the old fixtures. The bleachers had been restained. The scoreboard was operational, for the first time since the power supply failed, 3 years before Kenneth retired, and the budget had not included replacing it. He stood in the middle of the gym floor. This was the floor where he had found Sandra. Not metaphorically, not in some larger sense. This specific floor, the original hardwood under the new finish, these same walls, this same corner. He had walked through that door with a flashlight at 4:30 in the morning and crossed this floor and found a cardboard box and a blue blanket with yellow ducks and 5 words on a piece of notebook, paper, and a baby who was working very hard at the only communication available to her. He had not thought of it in those terms until now. He had thought of finding Sandra as something that happened at the school where he worked. And he had thought of the gym as the gym where he had found Sandra. But he had not until this moment stood on the refinished floor and understood that all of it was the same place, that the place had been his all along, that his name on it was not an honor being bestowed but a recognition of something that was already true and had been true for a long time. The ceremony was brief and organized by people who understood that the guest of honor would prefer less of it rather than more. The board president spoke for 6 minutes about the community and the importance of public institutions and the value of long service, and she was gracious and specific and did not use the word hero, which Kenneth appreciated. A parent from the school council said something warm and personal that he did not fully take in because he was looking at the near wall where the plaque was. Brass, set into the cinder block to the left of the main entrance, at eye level, in a dark wood frame with a clean border. The size of a hardcover book, as Sandra had said. The inscription was simple: Kenneth Lee Gymnasium, dedicated to the man who kept this building standing. He read it 3 times. He thought about 34 years of 4:30 mornings, about the specific sound of a mop handle on a waxed floor, the particular resistance of a pipe fitting that doesn't want to turn, the weight of a fluorescent tube in your hand when you're halfway up a ladder in an empty classroom on a Saturday. He thought about every work order he had written in his spiral notebooks, every quantity, every date, every note to himself about the condition of a room or a fixture or a stretch of hallway. He thought about what it meant to do something every day for 34 years in a building full of other people's children and to care, genuinely and without performance, whether the building was safe and warm and dignified, because they deserved that, because children deserved that, because the work deserved that, because that was what you did. If you were the person responsible for a thing and you took the responsibility seriously, the crowd was waiting for him to say something. He turned to face them, and he opened his mouth, and he found that he had very little, because the things worth saying about a life like his were already visible to anyone who had been paying attention, and the people in this room had been paying attention and making a speech about it. Felt like explaining a thing that explained itself. "Thank you," he said. "I don't know what else to say. Thank you." The applause was warm and genuine, and went on longer than he was comfortable with, which was the appropriate length. He stepped back from the plaque, and the 3 women who had been standing just behind him closed in around him, and he stood with them in the renovated gymnasium that now bore his name, and felt something that was not pride exactly, or not only pride, but the quieter thing underneath pride, the thing that comes when the work you did turns out to have been the right work, and the life you lived turns out to have been a life worth living. Stephanie had agreed to bring her class by on the following Friday. This had been arranged in advance. As a teaching moment, she explained about the history of the building and the people who maintained it, which was the kind of lesson that had no standardized test component and was therefore the kind of lesson she prioritized. She had told him it was coming. He had said he didn't need to be there. She had said she needed him to be there, and that was different. 22 third graders arrived in a double line and walked through the freshly painted hallways with the deliberate pace of people who understood they were on a field trip and therefore on good behavior, which meant they were still asking questions constantly, but doing it in slightly lower voices than usual. Stephanie walked them to the supply closet first. The old one near the east stairwell, the one where the light above the door had burned out so many times that he had stopped replacing it with anything less than a 10-year bulb. She told them this was where Mr. Lee used to work. She told them he had taken care of the whole building for longer than most of their parents had been alive. She told them about why buildings needed people who paid attention to them, about what happened to things when nobody took care of them, about what taking care of something really meant. A boy in the front of the group looked up at Kenneth with the direct, unself-conscious assessment of an 8-year-old who has decided to be interested in something. "Did you really live here?" he said. "No," Kenneth said. "I worked here." "Different thing." "My mom says you're a hero." Kenneth looked at Stephanie. She was looking at the ceiling, with the expression of someone suppressing something. He looked back at the boy. He thought about the right answer. He thought about what it meant to a third grader to hear an adult called a hero, and what it meant to him to hear the word applied to himself, a man who had mopped floors and fixed pipes, and kept a box of saltines in the lower cabinet, and sat on a concrete basement floor with a flashlight and a can of soup, and asked nothing of a child who had already been asked too much. "I'm a custodian," he said. "I fix things." The boy considered this with the serious concentration of someone doing genuine intellectual work. "But you fixed things even when nobody was watching." Kenneth looked at him. "Yeah," he said, "I did. That's the same as a hero," the boy said, with the certainty of someone who has just resolved a logical puzzle to his own satisfaction and sees no reason to revisit it. Stephanie had to turn away entirely. Laura came home every other weekend through the summer. She had worked out a schedule with her supervisor at the hospital that gave her 2 consecutive days off every 2 weeks, and she drove the 40 minutes from the city and arrived on Friday evenings and stayed through Sunday dinner and went back on Sunday night. She brought Kenneth's medication refills when his pharmacy ran low, which he had not asked her to do, but which she had taken on as a task that did not require discussion. She brought her blood pressure cuff and took his reading on Saturday mornings while he drank his coffee, and she recorded it in the small notebook she kept in her bag, and she told him the number and what it meant, because she believed that people made better decisions when they had information. One Saturday morning in July, she sat across from him at the kitchen table with her coffee and the notebook, and said the numbers were trending in the right direction, and Dr. Smith would probably be pleased at the August follow-up. "Good," Kenneth said. "You're actually taking the medication." "I said I would." "You also said you'd replace the ballast in the kitchen light for 3 months. That was different." "How?" "Nobody was watching the ballast." Laura looked at him. "Somebody's watching the medication." He drank his coffee. "I know," he said. She turned her mug in her hands, a habit she had had since she was young, the rotating motion of someone thinking through something without committing to saying it yet. Then she said, "I've been thinking about what you said in the courtroom. About showing up every day." He waited. "I've been thinking about it in terms of my patients," she said. "The ones who do well, the ones who really recover. It's almost never about the medicine. The medicine is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's about whether someone shows up for them. Family, mostly. A person who comes to the appointments and asks the right questions and makes sure the medication actually gets taken and notices when something is off." She looked at him. "I see the ones who don't have that. It's a different trajectory. Much worse outcomes statistically." "I've got 3 of you," Kenneth said. Yes, she said, you do. She looked at her coffee. I used to think that was luck, that we were the lucky ones. 3 kids who happened to have someone who showed up. A pause. Now I think it's not luck. I think you made a decision, over and over, every day, to be the person who showed up. And that's a different thing than luck. Luck is what you get. That's what you choose. He sat with that for a while. Your mother used to scramble eggs wrong, he said finally. Laura looked up at him. Too much butter. Not enough milk. I made them wrong for a week before you corrected me. She laughed. It was the quiet laugh, the one she kept for things that were funny only in the way of things that are also slightly painful. Things that belong to a part of your life that is over, and that you would not want back because the present is better, but that you also carry with you always, intact. You got it right after, she said. Took me 3 tries. You practiced on a Saturday. On your day off, you stood at the stove and made 4 batches until they were right. He hadn't known she'd seen that. He had thought she was upstairs with Sandra. You were supposed to be doing homework. I was watching from the stairs, she said. I didn't say anything because I didn't want you to stop. He looked at his coffee mug. He looked at the oak chair across from him, which had been Gary Young's chair at Sunday dinners, and before that had been nobody's chair in particular, a $4 chair from a garage sale that had turned out to be the right chair for the right spot, the way most of the good things in his life had arrived, without planning, without ceremony, as an answer to a specific need at a specific moment. He thought about the scrambled eggs. He thought about standing at the stove on a Saturday morning making 4 batches of scrambled eggs because a child had taught him the right way and he had wanted to get it right, not for any reason beyond getting it right. Stephanie brought her curriculum proposal to Sunday dinner in August. She had been working on it for weeks, she said, a unit for 3rd graders on what she called community infrastructure, which was the official title and which was a careful framing for what was essentially a unit on the people who keep things running, maintenance workers, sanitation workers, road crews, utility workers, the enormous invisible labor force that held a community together and that children moved through every day without being taught to see. She had submitted a draft to her principal and received approval to pilot it in the fall. It's not about you specifically, she said, with the care of someone who knows the person. Across the table will need to hear that. It's not called the Kenneth Lee curriculum. It's a unit about systems and the people who maintain them. But you got the idea from me, Kenneth said. I've been a teacher for 5 years, she said. I've been looking at this problem for 5 years. You just made it specific. He asked what the unit included. She described it. A week on physical systems, buildings and roads and utilities, how they worked and what they needed. A week on the people who maintained them, their training, their daily routines, the decisions they made. A week on what happened to systems that weren't maintained, with examples that were appropriate for 8-year-olds and that nonetheless made the consequences concrete. And a final week on what it meant to take responsibility for something, to care for a thing over time, to treat the maintenance of shared spaces as a form of civic participation. 8-year-olds can understand that, she said. They understand fairness. They understand when something is being taken care of and when it isn't. They just haven't been taught to name it. Kenneth looked at her across the dinner table, in the chair she had painted blue when she was 12. The chair that had been in this kitchen for 19 years and still held the particular blue she had chosen on a morning when she decided she wanted to make something her own. He thought about the basement floor. He thought about a can of soup and a tattered rabbit with one ear and a girl who had stopped expecting anything good, and then, slowly, in the steadiness of one ordinary day following another, had started again. He thought about what it cost to start again. He thought about what it took for a person to rebuild the belief that good things could happen to them after sufficient evidence to the contrary. He thought it took someone who showed up. Sunday dinner continued into September and October and into the first cold weeks of November when the trees on Birch Street went bare and the school across town had heat in every classroom, for the first time in several years. The prosecutor's case against Thompson moved through the courts at the particular pace of institutional justice. Thorough and slow, with updates that arrived through Sandra's occasional calls and the local news and the courthouse filing system she had learned to check on her lunch breaks. The process was unglamorous. It was also, he understood, the correct process, the way things were supposed to work when someone, in a position of public trust, had used that position to take what didn't belong to him. He did not attend any of the proceedings. He had done his part. The notebooks had done the rest. The kitchen table was full on the last Sunday of November. Stephanie had cooked roast chicken, the way she had been making it since she was old enough to handle a hot pan without supervision, which he had allowed earlier than any parenting book would have recommended, and which she had turned into a genuine skill over 20 years of practice. Mashed potatoes from scratch, green beans with the slivered almonds she had started adding 3 years ago, and which he had originally been skeptical of and was now dependent on. Kenneth took 2 helpings, which was the new standard Laura had established. After the August follow-up with Dr. Smith had gone well, on the grounds that adequate caloric intake was a medical requirement, and 2 helpings represented a minimum and not a ceiling. After dinner, Sandra washed the dishes. Laura dried. Stephanie put them away. They moved around the kitchen in the choreography of people who had grown up in the same small space and knew, without discussing it, how to occupy it simultaneously without collision. Sandra passed a plate to Laura, who dried it, who passed it to Stephanie, who reached to the upper cabinet where it went without looking, because they all knew where everything went, because things in this kitchen had been in the same places for many years. Kenneth sat at the table and watched them. He had been watching them do this, or something like it, for 20-odd years. The specific geography changed as they grew. The reach shortened or lengthened. The pace changed. The conversation changed. But the essential thing had not changed, which was 3 people moving through a space together, as though the space had been made for exactly this purpose, which in some sense it had been, which was not something he had planned, but something that had turned out to be true. Sandra put the last plate in the cabinet and turned around. She leaned against the counter, with her arms crossed, which was her thinking posture, the posture she had in any room when she had something she was working out. "You're quiet," she said. "I'm always quiet." Quieter than usual. He looked at the 3 chairs, oak metal, blue-painted wood, acquired one at a time over a stretch of years that had gone by faster than anyone had warned him they would. He looked at the 3 women who sat in them, who filled them, who had filled something in him that he had not known how to fill on his own after the monitors stopped beeping in a hospital room in November many years ago. He thought about what he wanted to say. He thought about whether he had the right words for it, which was always the question, and whether the words were necessary, which was sometimes the more important question. "I was thinking," he said, "that it turned out all right." Sandra looked at him. Laura looked at her coffee. Stephanie reached across the table and set her hand on top of his. She did not say anything. Neither did the others. The kitchen held the particular silence of people who are together in the presence of something that is true and does not need to be elaborated. Outside the window, Birch Street was dark and quiet. At the far end of the district, Clover Ridge Elementary stood, with its new paint, and its working heaters and its fire door that opened cleanly on well-oiled hinges. In the gymnasium, the brass plaque beside the main entrance caught the light from the parking lot in the particular way of things that have been set into a wall to stay. Kenneth Lee Gymnasium, dedicated to the man who kept this building standing. Inside the kitchen on Birch Street, the overhead light burned clean and even. No buzz, no flicker. Just light, steady and sufficient, the way he had always tried to leave things.